Good afternoon, and welcome to the session on energy and energy in Asia and energy in SEI Asia. So I'm going to close down that discussion, please. I think we'll make a start. There may be others who will join us, but I know lunch is often the more attractive option, just to have a long lunch. Thanks for joining today. In this session, we have about an hour and a half, and what the aim of this session is really about is to think about the work that has been done on energy in the region, reflect on that, but also reflect on work that has been done elsewhere that could be applied. So maybe tools or methods or approaches and conceptual ideas, things that could be applied in the region. And from that, act as a starting point to help SEI in Asia to think about how we might go forward with expanding our energy work in the region. And so what will be coming out of today will sort of be hopefully a sort of starting point for developing a strategy on our energy work, coordinating the energy work from the SEI in Asia Center going forward. We're not starting, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, we're not starting from nothing. There has actually been quite a bit of work in the region, and there's ongoing work right now as well. So I think that's a great starting point to build upon. But I know there are a number of people who are very interested in working more in the region who have not yet done so, but there's a lot of goodwill around that. And so I'm really keen, acting as a focal point on energy at the SEI in Asia Center, to capitalize upon that and identify and make sure I know who I should be liaising with as we look for new opportunities and partnerships. If you recall my presentation a couple of days ago, we have these different trends around energy. On the one hand, rising demand expected to rise by 80% in the next 20 odd years, a potentially continued use of fossil fuels in many countries who have those resources domestically. You have challenges on then, is there a way in which we can green that trajectory, energy development trajectory, such that we can meet increasing demand, but in a way that is more low carbon? At the same time, there's a number of energy and development issues related to energy access. Many governments might say, well, we just need to use the resources we have. It's the cheapest resources that are available domestically, and we want to use that to increase access. So sometimes there's then a lot of ethical debates about the extent to which countries should be able to use their domestic resources, even if they are polluting, for other development goals, such as increasing energy access. And so it's navigating very complex issues, and the policies and the dialogue around which pathways to pursue. It can be quite complex. There's vested interests, there's path dependency along existing infrastructure pathways, perhaps centralized infrastructure, well established. Alternatives may be more decentralized, but that might not be where the mindset is about how to develop in many countries in the region. And of course, you've got issues around electricity and power generation, but there's also this big issue on cooking and cooking fuels and the implications for indoor air pollution and other issues. So today what we're going to do is I'd briefly like to I will ask someone to briefly reflect on these issues from the perspective of the political and environmental context in the region. Then we will go to a panel session where a few SEI staff members will, this will be hosted by Stefan, and a few SEI staff members will be asked to come and talk a little bit about the work they've been doing, some of which has been done in the region, some of which could be applied in the region. We'll then break out into groups with a couple of tasks to dig a bit deeper, and then come back together finally to share what we've been doing in the groups, and then wrap up for the session. So I would like to ask Apachai to come on as SEI associate to come and just reflect a little bit with the vast experience he has working in the region and the environmental issues, political issues within the region, to reflect on the energy trajectory, potential future energy trajectories in the region in the current political and environmental context. So, thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, and good afternoon. So I have the challenging task of keeping you awake. Anyway, you know, I think if you have listened to my presentation yesterday, then you get a picture already of get a picture already of the situation and environmental sustainability issues facing the region. There are certainly lots of it, but I think there's also a growing sense of hope in a way that, at least as I said, that in that blueprint that now ASEAN has for 2025, at least comparing with previous blueprints of this nature, then there's much more green things or references, even in the economic, even in the political security sectors, besides the environmental one. So in that sense, there's a bit of a hope, but let me just maybe quickly run through in terms of that blueprint that I mentioned, where there's a reference specifically to energy-related matters. In the economic blueprint, there's a section called Sustainable Economic Development, and there's one item which says foster policies supportive of renewable energy and set collective targets accordingly, right? And then another item says they want to go towards low carbon technologies, of course with international support, to ensure access and mechanisms and so forth, and then they also want to promote more use of biofuels for transportation, and they also include free trade in biofuels within the region, investment in R&D in third generation biofuels, and then specifically on the energy section, this was the Sustainable Economic Development section, which by the way has never appeared in the AEC blueprint before and is now there. Of course it includes other aspects too, but I won't go into it since it's not related to energy. But then in a separate section on energy, this is what it says. That's relevant to us. It's basically, they also want to promote coal and clean coal technologies, and then, well, so they say, they enhance the image of coal in ASEAN through promotion of clean coal technologies, as well as increase the number of the clean coal technology projects by 2020, And then on the energy efficiency and conservation section, they say, okay, we want to reduce energy intensity in ASEAN by 20% as a medium-term target in 2020, and by 30% as a long-term target in 2025, based on 2005 levels, okay? And then on renewable energy, they want to increase the component of RE, renewable energy, to a mutually agreed percentage number in ASEAN, in the ASEAN energy mix, which means the total primary energy supply by 2020. And so in that sense, I think the target was, I think it's something like 23% or something like that, okay? I mean, I don't know, I'm not an energy expert. Maybe the experts in here could tell me whether that is, to me it doesn't sound very ambitious. You prove me wrong, whether that is the case or not. To me, I think that's a very lowest common denominator. I mean, but that's how ASEAN works anyway. So kind of aspirational goal, as they even call it, And then in terms of, this is information that I got, actually this is from IEA, yeah? They talk about, they project what is ASEAN's energy mix between 2013 and 2040, yeah? And this is what it says, and this is where it gets a bit disconcerting, because coal right now occupies about 32% as of 2013, yeah? But that will go up to 50% in 2040, according to this IEA report. Whereas all the other energy sources are either stable or going down, okay? So on the one hand, they're gonna pump more CO2 and other things, yeah? But then on the other hand, they say, oh, they want to reduce. And then, of course, ASEAN also attends this climate change convention, and they have also promised certain reductions, yeah? So I haven't done the calculations, but somebody has to do it, to say, what does it come out to be? Is it negative or positive or zero? You know, the net. You want to do this, increase coal, and then you still want to reduce, where are you going to reduce? You know, I don't know whether, I haven't seen any analysis done on a sort of a broad scale as to what exactly would happen in the end, yeah? And then, as we know, as I showed you at the presentation yesterday, I mean, Laos wants to already declare this a national development policy to be the battery of Southeast Asia. And what they mean by that is they're going to just use hydropower as that revenue generating source and then sell electricity. And this is why they're building dams in the Mekong and elsewhere. Basically, it's not so much to power Laos, because they don't need too much. The population is very sparse, not too much. Mostly it's to sell it back to Thailand, to Vietnam, to China, and so forth, yeah? But that, you know, is the crux of the development dilemma. On the one hand, you say, well, that's going to destroy environment, that's going to pump so many, you know, or whatever, you know, into the atmosphere, it's going to impact livelihoods. But on the other hand, they're saying, well, this is my right to development. You know, what have you to say? You have already developed. So, you know, but now it's my time to develop, okay? But then how do we develop? And how do we manage this transboundary resource, whether it's air, water, land, or whatever, okay? So I think that is probably the crux of the challenge. That's how the way I see it. And that's how I think we want to also project it into our SOER report, right? I think, as I mentioned, ICI is preparing the State of Environment report for ASEAN. We are trying to sort of reflect some of these dilemmas and these challenges that the region faces. And I think it also calls for more intersectoral, cross-sectoral dialogue. Maybe the energy minister needs to talk more with the environment ministers. I don't think that has happened. I don't know whether it has happened anywhere around the world, maybe some, but certainly not so much in ASEAN as far as I know. So maybe that needs to be, or maybe SEI has a role to foster this kind of cross-sectoral dialogue. I think there will be a lot of these that needs to be done. And of course, we're also talking about monitoring evaluation, and we have to also make sure that this also goes into the KPIs or the indicators somehow, yeah? So maybe I just stop there as an overview, yeah? And then if you have any questions or clarification, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay, thank you. I think that was very helpful. I think it paints quite an interesting challenge for actually energy work going forward, when you have like climate commitments on the one hand, but quite pessimistic. Like on the one hand, the policies are saying we want more renewables, but we're also having more coal. Thanks very much, and that's well, that's reality, isn't it? So it's a challenge to engage, but exciting opportunity as well. Let me hand over now to the host of our exciting new talk show we're establishing here. Should be I don't know, maybe a yearly or weekly, or I don't know, maybe how regular it will be, but Energisa, I think. Let me hand over.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you for the introduction. Hi and welcome to SEI HBO and our weekly talk show, Energisa. I'm your host, Stefan Bösner, and I have 4 distinguished guests tonight who should set the scene and how energy work in SEI and SEI Asia can be done. Please, let me introduce the guests. We have 4 very distinguished guests hailing from different backgrounds, different centers, and all bringing their different expertise to the table. And without further ado, let me start with the person who is perhaps one of the most capable people of introducing energy issues in Asia. My first guest, he was a member of the scientific advisory panel of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. He was the governor of Global Atmospheric Pollution Forum, and he is our distinguished policy director. Please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Johan Sjöstedt.
Hello.
The floor is yours. Hello.
Oh, the floor is mine. I thought you were going to ask me a question then. Well,
First, I'll give you 2 minutes to present your work in SCI Asia, and then we have a little chit-chat.
okay.
So
So,
please, the floor is yours.
so do I get my slide?
Yes, please.
Can I stand up?
As you like.
Okay. So this is my slide, and what I want to talk about here is to try and unpick this and to mention that, you know, when we're talking about the climate debate, people always think about CO2, energy, that's the only show in town, we've got to reduce CO2 and that'll save us. And we have here this blue line going up as a reference. It's the sort of thing we all know about. It's going to get extremely hot if we don't do anything. The red line is then what happens if we do work on CO2 and we reduce CO2. What you might notice that not a lot happens at first to the global temperature. It doesn't start bringing it down straight away, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that you've got a very long-lived CO2 gas, you've got an existing pool and you're adding small amounts or subtracting small amounts every year. The second is that if you're going to reduce CO2 in Indian power stations, you'll also reduce SO2, and SO2 is cooling. So the initial short-lived response is actually you've got, you know, a balancing out of the cooling and removing the cooling and warming. And so you don't get an initial response. And that's quite dangerous. So what I'm like to say is that with a pathway towards the Paris goals are very important. It's not just the end goal, which is either a peak warming or a 2100 target of 2 degrees. But how we get there is really important. And it's really important for a number of reasons. One is that if you could reduce the degree of warming, and this is where the short-lived climate pollutants come in, and also links to energy, things like methane. Obviously, we've got methane coming out of the oil and gas and the coal industry. And if you can reduce methane emissions, you get a very rapid response because its lifetime's only 10 years. But also black carbon emissions, or some sources of black carbon, it only exists in the atmosphere for a few days. You stop those emissions, you get a very rapid climate response. And also HFCs, we've got the Kigali Agreement, but it's still an issue. Anyway, the calculations show that we could actually substantially reduce the rate of climate change over the next few decades if we were to be successful in implementing measures which reduce these emissions. And so then we can have a pathway which is lower, and the difference between the pathway which allows a rapid rise coming back down to 2 degrees is a cumulative warming. And that cumulative warming in Asia is really important for things like mountain glaciers in the Himalayas. It means committed sea level rise, and these are things that can be avoided if we then combine a strategy on the short-lived species together with the CO2, then we might get this bottom line here, reaching the target on a low rate of warming trajectory, and then we can help to achieve some of our development goals.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Could you perhaps provide us with some examples? Your pathways are important, not the end goal, but also the pathways. Is there some countries or some stakeholders with whom you already worked in these kind of issues here in the region, and what was your experience, if so?
So a number of countries have come together. So at the moment, there's about 52 countries have joined the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. A number of countries, unfortunately not as many as we'd like, have joined from the Asian region. So Cambodia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Maldives, Korea, Japan, I think that's it, have joined from this region. So Thailand hasn't joined, for example. And so these countries are, you know, they're both committed to taking action on these short-lived climate pollutants by looking at some of the energy sources. So, you know, when we're talking about the link to energy, it's not just a CO2 issue. It's also an air pollution issue. It's also a methane emission issue. And so we're working with Bangladesh, Philippines, and Maldives at the moment in helping them to plan action on reducing their emissions. And they're taking this forward, you know, so certainly Bangladesh we've worked with the longest. They're trying to implement issues to address certain sectors, transport, cooking in households, lighting, brick kilns, things like that.
Interesting. You mentioned Cambodia as well, but you're not already working with Cambodia.
We've started working with Cambodia. We have two types of funding. So this is funding that comes through the trust fund of the CCAC. One part is helping countries develop national planning, but the other is institutional support. So in order for them to sort of just kickstart interest in the country, we give money to the Ministries of Environment for them to employ people to help them. So that far we've got with Cambodia, but not with the national planning. So that could come later.
Because the way I see it, and this feeds into the capacity discussion which we had, SCI has a strong presence, especially in the agricultural sector in Cambodia, so perhaps there might be some synergies to be found across ministries, environmental ministry. I think is an important stakeholder for both the air pollution problematic, but also for agricultural development. So would you agree that this might be perhaps an axis to explore for future work of energy in Asia?
Absolutely. And one thing we did do was, well, it's only a few days' work, looking at their environmental plan. They got an overarching environmental plan in Cambodia, and we looked at all the linkages to short-lived climate pollutants that there could be and sent them a report, which has probably been ignored, but still. You know, so there's a start there to some of the work. But, I mean, a lot of what we're doing is actually training people up to, so that they're the ones undertaking the planning. We're only providing advice. So it's both, you know, sort of knowledge, but it's also capacity enhancement and transferring the ability for them to make their own planning.
Excellent. Perhaps last question, and this feeds also into capacity building, how to support people to take action. From your perspective as the policy director, or very involved in the policy process at SCI, what are the challenges for SCI Asia, for SCI in Asia, for work which is to be done here in the region from a policy perspective? Is there some things which we should pay attention to, especially in the region? What is the main challenge, for example?
Well, there were some little discussions with Apichai in the corridors. One of the issues that, you know, so we've got the Hays Protocol within the ASEAN region, so you've got transboundary issues being dealt with in terms of mainly the sort of burning of forests. But of course, the emissions that we're talking about, they are transboundary in nature across the whole of Southeast Asia, and also linking to South Asia and China. And I'm not aware of anyone who in the region who is looking in a coordinated way at those. So that's one thing. The other would be, you know, it would be very interesting to work with the governments of the region, if they were to be so minded, to try and get people onto a level playing field. I mean, I guess some countries are much further forward than others. But to develop some sort of regional collaboration, I think, could be very interesting if that could be engendered. And obviously ASEAN would be an obvious place to start. But just so you know, we also have 2 PhD students, one from Thailand, from the Pollution Control Department, who's with us in York, and one from Indonesia. And they're doing LEAP IBC work for these 2 countries, but also looking at transboundary transport. So there's work we can build on, but I think there's a lot of opportunity which isn't being realized in this region. And I'm very intrigued to find out why Thailand hasn't joined the CCAC. That would be, I'd like to know why. I'm not sure. There's probably some politics in there somewhere.
You think?
Excellent. So this kind of exploring, developing transboundary governance systems, or exploring this kind of governance perspective of transboundary energy issues would be an axis to explore. For the moment, I thank you very much for your presentation. Please stay with us. I think when we have the chance to talk with everybody. We might open the floor for questions. But now, I'd like to invite our second guest to the panel, a very unknown person. He spoke to you 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago. He was the Deputy Director of SCI Africa, so please pay attention and respect. He worked for the German Development Institute, for the UN Conference on Trade and Development. He's now tasked with the very interesting task to set up an energy program in SCI Asia. So please welcome our own Oliver Johnson. I see you have fans already. The floor is yours. 2 minutes from your experience. And now, if we can have the second slide. Yes. Thank you.
So, thanks for this opportunity to briefly talk about some work that we have done engaging with SNV, the Dutch development organization, on their cook stove programs. This work was led us to Cambodia in 2 projects actually, 1 year after the other. The first was helping SNV look at its theory of change associated with its cook stove interventions. When I first arrived at SEI, about 5 months after starting, we had the first or second science forum, and I gave a presentation, and someone from the floor said, "What's your theory of change?" And I didn't know what to say, so I went after that and read up on theory of change, and I was looking from a very academic perspective. In this project, it was really interesting to then properly engage with the kind of, particularly the donor community or the development NGO community's understanding of theory of change. So we were trying to understand how their interventions really were trying to achieve certain outcomes and then, of course, lead to the impacts they wanted to see. And we looked at Rwanda, Kenya, Nepal, and Cambodia. So here they were implementing, supporting some the market development associated with a advanced cook stove using pellets, and it was solar powered because the solar power was used to power a small fan in this gasifier stove, so particular technology that requires sort of airflow for the cooking. Very clean, but quite costly, about $100. So challenges around finance and so on. We subsequently went on to work with SNV when they asked us to do support another project, looking at the same stove, but looking at how health awareness promotion campaigns might incentivize users to actually take out a loan to get this stove. The finding was that really, from a user perspective, that the health aspect is not a major part of their decision-making process. The interesting thing is, from a development finance perspective, the public health perspective, it's a major reason for fuel switching and to cleaner fuels. And so that's quite interesting, because on the one hand, if you want to get a project, you might have to put that in your project proposal. But from the user side, if you want a real intervention to work, you have to think very differently about what the user, how the user makes decisions.
Thank you very much for this interesting overview of what you have been doing here in the Asian region. So I think Cambodia might emerge as one country where like there's synergies, people working already there. I don't want to put words in your mouth, and this is then to discuss in the groups. We have nice flip charts, draw, write, do whatever. No, draw and limit yourself to drawing and writing. You moved from Africa to Asia, both times working on energy issues. Do you think there are some similarities of the challenges the African region faces with the Southeast Asian region they face? Are they completely different? What are you bringing from Africa to the region?
I think there are similarities and differences. I think it's clear that at the broad level, the debates around development pathways and the extent to which countries should be able to use their domestic resources regardless of whether they're clean or dirty, that's a debate that's very clearly happening here, and we see in Africa as well. When it comes to the solutions, the interventions or the the policies, the technologies, the organizational change, the individual behavior change, and the complexity of achieving that change. You see that in all countries. The context might differ, but the challenges and the complexity of achieving any change, particular change, is quite obvious in all cases. So, given this example, when we were looking across Kenya, Rwanda, Nepal, and Cambodia, we could quite clearly see that although there were slight differences, when it came to an intervention in building markets and building enabling environments, trust between partners, between various members, various actors along the supply chain was incredibly important. It was incredibly important in all cases to learn from failure and adapt, and that was quite universal across the cases. So I think bringing that knowledge that I've gained from the work I've been doing in African region, I think can be very valuable here. But again, looking at the countries are diverse, and well, they are in Africa as well. I mean, it's a giant continent. So, but I think in the regional aspect and the regional integration or regional discussion could be quite interesting here. In Africa, it was more on a East Africa regional, so, that kind of level. But I think that could be interesting.
Excellent. You mentioned, like, if I got you correctly, you were mainly looking in this kind of Nepal and Cambodia on a household level, small scale, and developing a market chain for like small scale energy solutions, for example. We heard by the introduction speech that this is one part of the problem, but another problem is these huge, big infrastructure investments which still go largely into coal and fossil fuels. Is there any work you've been doing in Africa on these kind of large-scale electrification projects, for example? Is there something which you would like to elaborate in, or try to see lessons learned and apply them in Asia?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of things. We have a ongoing project called TransRisk, which actually has a component looking at in biogas in Indonesia. But one of the things there we're looking at is the development of geothermal, large-scale, centralized power generation. And so we have been looking at that, some of the challenges of these very centralized systems and the communities on the ground that they do or do not engage with, but have an impact on. So whether it's displacement of resettlement of people, whether it's land access, which is a hugely political issue in Kenya, that's quite interesting. We recently did some focus group discussions. One was with just the centralized government and state-owned enterprises, and the other one included the community representatives, and completely different perspectives on the issue. I think that's been that has resonance perhaps with some of the hydropower development. Another area we did do a study on was looking at this notion of sustainable infrastructure, and connects back to the gender and social equity discussions, whereby Shivan was working with us on this, and we brought in this component of sustainable infrastructure also should consider the equity dimension. So it should be sustainable and equitable infrastructure development, because a lot of the centralized infrastructure development that happens all over the world often comes from a perspective where centralized big-scale infrastructure will lead to will power big industries, and you'll have this trickle-down effect to the poorest, and this is the way we need to go. And I think the reality is that doesn't always happen, and often many of the poor in rural areas or urban areas, right next to perhaps the transmission lines, still get left out. So I think the way we tried to frame that was about balancing, the different types of infrastructure, small scale, large scale, balancing, private returns on investment and affordability, and so on and so forth. And that could be something that could be useful.
Well, it seems Niall has recruited the right person to work on many levels: large scale, small scale, gender, equity. So thank you very much. We're running a little bit late, so let me, without further ado, bring our third guest. tonight to my talk show table. She is an energy systems modeler and a mathematician by training, which always astounds me as a political science nerd because I can't understand numbers. Her research interests are in evolution and the needs of future energy systems. So I think a really fresh perspective to like complement the political science, social science perspective with a little bit of more stuff grounded in numbers and realities. Please give a very welcome applause to Mrs. Georgia Savidou from Stockholm. Unfortunately, we don't have music, so welcome.
Thanks.
Please take a seat. The floor is yours. 2 minutes followed by question. Thank you very much.
2 minutes, that's a challenge. So let me start by saying that I'm going to talk about some work that have not been applied in Asia yet. So it would be great to hear your ideas for areas to apply. And also mention that this is ongoing work, and so your feedback is very much welcome, and you can also help shape this work. So a big part of our energy work at SEI involves energy modeling and scenario development. And so we do that using different tools like LIB or LibIBC. We use the tools ourselves, and we also hope that the tools will be used by people in policymaking. So any user of the tools has to make one of the important decisions that they have to make is about the technology mix for the future. So when deciding what the market penetration of the technology of interest would be in the future, there is a process of thinking needed. And so what we think is that we can make this thinking in a more systematic way, and that's why we suggest to follow the framework that you see right behind me. So it's from IPCC. And so I'm not sure if you can read.
Mostly written for ants, but...
But I can walk you through it. So the idea is that we start by what we say it's a theoretical upper bound for the technology penetration. And then we go into different levels till we reach the market penetration. So we start first with the technological potential, and then we ask questions like, is the technology of interest in place? Is it available? And if it's available, is the knowledge needed to use that technology available, or the associated infrastructure? Then moving on, we go to the socio-economic potential, and that involves a lot of thinking when it comes to attitudes and social norms. And so this is very relevant in different contexts and different countries. Then we move on to the economic potential, which takes into account the market, so whether there is competition in the market. And so this would help the user have a better idea of what the penetration of a technology could be. And in each level, there are several barriers to be taken into account, and there are also several actions to remove those barriers. A bit on the methodology, we think that it's very important to consider the type of the barrier. So a barrier can have an additive effect or a multiplicative effect to the penetration of the technology. And I think it's important to really take into account these different effects. So it can be one-to-one relationship or one-to-many, when a policy like removing fossil fuel subsidies can have several effects. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Even under time, not overtime, under time, so that gives me the time to ask some questions. Very interesting work and relevant, I guess. You talked about barriers in your last bit. What do you see from your experience in working on the region or even in the region, Southeast Asian region? From a modeling perspective, from a systems perspective, what would be like one major barrier in the region? You can pick a country if the question is too broad. But one is something with like, oh yeah, this is a barrier, I came across this in my studies, I want to explore these issues further. What would that be? If funding was not a problem. CEDA gives you 1 million, I don't know, SEK or something like this, and then you run with it, what would you do?
Well, I'm not sure if this is a question for me to answer because I haven't worked in the region that much. But maybe picking up from our discussion with Niall yesterday on an example on clean cook stoves, which appears to be a big challenge in the region. We talked a lot about the technology and that having the right technology, it's one of the, very important, and it could be a big barrier which is in the very initial step, which then delays or prevents the whole process.
Right technology, so right for the users, adapted to user needs, you mean?
Yeah, and I think a crucial part is when the technology doesn't work, then the user, if there is a delay in fixing the technology, then the user already goes back to the previous traditional way of cooking, and then it's already giving up and changing the.
So I also see a lot of complementaries, Oliver, looking at the market chain from a marketing perspective, so like more an end user, how to market cook stoves, for example, to the user. You are in the middle of the value chain. What happens when the technology breaks down and people don't know how to maintain it, for example? So a lot of synergies. I'm talking about synergies. I made a stupid joke before, but I'm really like, I don't... I'm a little bit slow. Mathematics was never my strong suit. And sometimes I'm under the impression that within SCI, there's like several tribes. There's like policy people, social science people, hard science people, and then there's modelers. And for me, it's like you can see the matrix and stuff like this. I can't. So it's interesting how to bring these tribes together. And do you have the impression that those two tribes, let's say the social scientists and the modelers, the mathematicians, talk to each other? And if not, would that perhaps be like one role of the energy cluster in SCI Asia to facilitate this kind of cross-silo, cross-nerd thinking or something like this?
Well, thanks so much for this question. I think especially in the work I'm doing in this project is exactly trying to bridge a bit policy and energy modeling. So I'm working in this with Johan, and so it's the policy perspective, but also with Charlie when we have the modeling perspective, and Mons where we have more the research, if we say perspective.
Do you know the too many cooks spoil the broth thing? Saying?
I should be careful.
Good answer. But I interrupted you, sorry.
Fingers crossed. And so I think that I think people could talk much more, and I have the impression that we might be biased, both modelers but also social scientists within SCI, that talking to the other side is hard and people won't understand. But what I come to realize is that when you do sit together and talk, there is a lot of understanding, and you can take a step back and then realize, oh, maybe I need to change a bit my thinking or bring some more perspective to it, and I think that's always useful.
So first steps are there, could be intensified. Perhaps in Energy Asia is then the model how to do it best or better at least. So thank you very much for your input. Let me introduce our last guest on this very interesting panel. He actually presents the business side of our story because he's not only a researcher and a lecturer at Udayana University in Bali, he's also the very own CEO of his own company. Please welcome our distinguished guest, Mr. Takeshi Takama. Takeshi, same for you. You have 2 minutes.
Okay.
Talk.
So this is my local and international partner, as well as stakeholder, to produce our biogas. Why are we doing this? Nearly 50% of Indonesians are still live based on dirty biomass, such as firewood, which is more than 120 million people. Best NGO Indonesia producing only 20,000 biogas digester last 10 years, which means only 2,000 biogas digester a year. This is too slow. And out of this 2,000, 20% are not working. Government one is even worse. 60% are not working. And those biogas digesters are left in the ground. So as a solution, we producing a scalable biogas digester, which can be produced in the factory, can be 2,000 in a month or even in a week. And if they don't use it, they roll back and send it to us. The market can be amazing. Like according to this NGO, Indonesia only can be 2 million biogas digester can be installed. If it costs $1,000, $2,000 million, it's quite a conservative number. You know, I said 120 million people are based on dirty biomass. So our approach is we try to scaling this model. In terms of finance and policy, we try to incentivize farmers how to reach those 2 million people or 120 million people. And we need innovation, frugal innovation, which means cutting costs from $1,000 to $100. Scalability is crucial. I can tell, you know, okay, this my farmer is very happy, blah, blah, blah. We install 5 biogas digester a year. This is just self-satisfaction. 120 million people are waiting for this technology. So our team are including Stefan, Oliver, and Richard, Francis, TransRisk people working this as a partially action research project. So from SCI, we need a support to understand how to scale up this in terms of finance, how to get the support from international community policies, how to incentivize the farmers, and we need actual fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. Please take a seat. That's my seat.
Oh, sorry.
That's my spot. Sorry. Excellent presentation. What I really like about your entity, I always miss Sureco. Sureco, check it out online, magnificent website. It was so great. You describe yourself as a think tank, but also as a do tank. And I think this illustrates well, I think it was one of your interns/co-workers who came up with the design of this inflatable biodigester. And really like, because sometimes within SCI we spend a lot of time necessary research, building a science base, but then sometimes we forget the do part. So what do you say, what would be your advice from experience in Bali, especially for Oliver and the emerging energy cluster, and I think Niall is also like very interested in the do part of things. What would you recommend that we should do differently or better when we start the energy cluster to be more do and not only think?
I don't think everyone needs to do this do part. We can collaborate. But for me, this is very useful because I understand this is not just something we make ivory tower. We try at the field, and it's something in the field we can write as a report. So, and SCI is good at this. So I think in SCI should focus on what you are good at, and then we can collaborate together.
So we deliver the think, you deliver the do?
Yes.
I think that's a good motto.
I think so.
Thank you very much. To all my participants, you can give them a round of applause for the insights and for kickstarting this debate. We have now 2 options. I am not a good timekeeper. There is questions from the floor, and then we have prepared a little quiz of 4 or 5 questions. Questions, quiz, or not at all, just directly into the groups. Everybody's asleep. Wake up! Go to groups? Oh yeah, please.
Kerli from SCI Tallinn. I have a question for Georgia because I've also been using Leap. And my question is that is the tool meant for a modeler to have better decisions on how you can use more efficient technologies in order to have a more efficient future for energy? because you as a modeler are already inserting the data to LEAP in terms of the technologies, and you produce different scenarios? Or is the tool meant for policy makers? Because in that case, you as a modeler still need to provide different scenarios where all those technologies are already considered.
That's a good question. Well, I think it can be used by both, depending on what you're after. So the user of LEAP could be a modeler, but it could be also a policymaker. So the idea is to enable the user to have a more of a narrative why he makes this choice of 20 or 30 or 50% market penetration of the specific technology of interest.
Just a very quick response also to that question is, I'm talking to Charlie Heaps. I mean, I think people in SEI have actually different views of what a model is for or what to do with it. And I think Charlie's perspective is quite interesting, because he says, as far as he's concerned, LEAP is there as a start to a conversation, not necessarily to provide the answer. And really, and I've seen it in action, just in terms of the sort of like the linkages between the energy and environment that you mentioned before. In Côte d'Ivoire, they've started using LEAP IBC, but it was the Environment Ministry. And he said it was interesting. Now we've actually started producing some numbers. The climate change people come to us and say, oh, that looks interesting. And the same happened in Peru when the Environment Department were developing stuff on air pollution. And the energy people, Ministry of Energy and Mines came along and said, oh, we'd like to do some of that. And you're creating the linkage by the use of the tool. So what's the most important thing? Is it the numbers they come up with, the bar charts? Or is it the fact that you've actually created a form of communication between two ministries that never talk to each other otherwise? Well, maybe that's over-exaggerating, but sometimes. They seem pretty pleased in the region anyway.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Questions, groups, questions. Quick questions, quick answers.
Quick question then. Just given the regional issues here with the growth in coal, it's a fact, it's going to happen. Both on the modelling side, what can we do from the modelling side to answer some of those questions or to open the debate to start with? And what can we do from the different technologies that we have? I like the idea of using the biogas, but at the scale that we're looking at, is it a real solution? It's a viable solution, it's a business solution, but is it going to solve the climate problems? I want to challenge us as a regional program. We're going to be designing a program to really solve some of these bigger problems. How do we do it? Against, again, the political side of things, where people probably in power own the coal plants, or at least have some sort of income from them. We need to set a program that's going to put the right information to make that decision. And you said yesterday, we talked about this, it's winning their hearts, whatever, but clearly winning corrupt politicians' hearts isn't going to solve the problem. So I'm just trying to think, with the model there that can create a debate with the different technologies that we have, what do we really have to do to change this? Because otherwise we're going to destroy so much of what's positive elsewhere by going up to 55% coal over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So it's a big challenge.
Oh, pick a couple, then. Sorry?
I have pretty much similar question, but also another one, more specific to the biogas issue. You know, I was trying to understand what is the problem that you want to solve with this micro biogas. Is that the energy side? Then I'm having doubts whether it could compete in the future with micro solar, if it's, you know, for the cooking and electricity or energy. Or is it just using the you know, bio-waste resources and manure and so on, kind of, rather than, you know, let's not waste it and use it for, or is it for, you know, in Estonia, why we talk a lot about biogas is, you know, you have anyway the sludge from water treatment or manure, so to protect the groundwater for that reasons, it's reasonable to collect it and make the biogas plants. So it's because also in Estonia it doesn't compete with other forms of energy rather. So you need to pick your battle or functionality of. So could you elaborate on that? You know, what is the actual problem you want to solve with that?
Thank you. And Babette and then Kalle and then.
Okay, I'd like to address my question to Oliver. Yeah. Now you're coming to the Mekong region. Okay, when we talk about renewables here, hydropower sort of looms large in the region, and there's been a whole history of controversy around hydropower. And you're looking upstream and downstream issues, for instance. We just came from Myanmar, for instance, conducting interviews, about 20 of them. Hydropower firms, they cannot get past the feasibility and the scoping stage. They are beleaguered by, apart from financial problems or investments, also because of civil society questioning of hydropower. That's one hand. And the second is, of course, there's also still, as Achan Apichai said, a predilection towards fossil fuels. So my question to you is, how are you going to position the energy cluster in a region ridden with energy controversy?
Thank you. He's got to ask a question which became a statement and then he goes away.
Could you really handle this many questions at the same time? Well, I would like to tag on to something that you mentioned, which my dear program host here, we also discussed yesterday, which I think is a bit absent from this discussion. It's as if there are no hard choices to be made, which will actually set the context for where this region's energy future lies. I think there are important actors that need to be understood and their choices. China's investments along the One Belt One Road, what type of investments are they going to finance? They claim it to be green, but we don't know what green is. Is ultra supercritical coal power green because it's better than conventional coal power? What's the standards? What's the aims? Where is the overcapacity in Chinese manufacturing and coal power plants going? Where is the new their aspirations for Australian coal going? They claim they want to send it to the poor countries to provide better energy futures. Are there alliances between coal power manufacturers in China and Australian coal miners, and etc., etc.? Where is India going? I mean, there are a number of big questions out there. And I think, yes, Georgia, you have the modeling capacity to actually catch those different scenarios. But I think we need to lift our views a bit and ask those questions.
Thank you very much. Panel?
Well, maybe I suggest an alternative that... Maybe I suggest an alternative... microphone to use. Maybe the alternative is that we don't answer these questions, and I would request that TAC joins the group with Laurie so that you can discuss it on the table, and then because the next session, if I may, is to group together, probably in 3 groups, discuss some of these questions about the specifics of the work we've been doing, but then come up with per table 3 issue areas that we would like to take on board. And I would request that, Kalle, in your group, this and maybe some of the ways you might envisage it could be explored could be written down, so that, because I can't answer Babette's question at this point either, because I also need a coalition of the willing to work with to look at some of these things. I think what you're bringing up, Babette, was really important, but hopefully if some of these can be written down, and I would like also in your groups, when you write the issues down, to put a name down of the person who I can contact to then take this forward as opportunities arise, so that it's not just things that we could do, and if someone's interested, but there's a specific person who would like to work with me and colleagues, on these issues. So if we do it that way, we can utilize the answers will be found within the tables, if that's okay. So maybe we can group up, and there were 2 tasks, so that's just to spend 5 or 10 minutes, because I know there's people working on the region on energy issues that have not been on this panel, so they might want to share. And then after that, I can ring a bell or clap my hands, or we can ask you now to move on to the second, which is coming up on your table with 3 issue areas that you think are critical. And they may be at different levels, of course, this macro level, and I think, or micro level, a household. And that could really be helpful to start generating, using that as a basis for developing a strategy within the energy cluster.
What an elegant and efficient solution to the time problem. My Germanic heart rejoices. So please go to the groups, the tables. Perhaps you can spread out. Here's only 3 people, and let's do 3 groups. Is that? So perhaps people from the back could move to one of the groups here, and then Takeshi, as pointed out, joins this group, and then.
I think that table is fine. This table, and maybe after you go to the back table.
Out of the blue sky thinking it's fine.
So
Thank
if
you very
could
much.
use the flip charts.
have to respond. Like, so I think according to that final continuation webinar, they are very happy with the result. Actually, the director is the most excited. He's the one actually typing more on the chatting. So he was very much excited. So there's a few, right? Few points, right? Yeah. And then basically he understands that there is no money for this, so he's not